Hello, my name is Jane and welcome to 100 Stories Deep. Today I'm going to be reading a story from this book, Paddington at Large by Michael Bond. You may think that's an unusual choice, but this book was written in 1966 and that means it's 54 years old, and the stories about Paddington Bear and the way that Mr. and Mrs. Brown accept Paddington into their lives makes me think quite a lot about what's happening in our world today. Before I read you the story, I'll give you a little bit of background about Paddington Bear. So he came originally from deepest, darkest Peru. He was brought up by his Auntie Lucy. Sadly, Auntie Lucy became a bit old and frail and had to move into a retirement home for bears in Lima, which is the capital of Peru. Worried about what would happen to her precious nephew, she took the big, brave, bold decision to send Paddington to the other side of the world. So she packed up his suitcase with marmalade sandwiches and put a label around his neck which said, "Please look after this bear." And off he went on a journey of discovery across to the other side of the world. He was found on Paddington Station by Mr. and Mrs. Brown, who, reading the note, took Paddington into their home and accepted him as a member of their family. And whilst Paddington lived with Mr. and Mrs. Brown, he had some amazing adventures, and this is one of them. This is called Paddington Hits the Jackpot. "Lucky for some," exclaimed Mr. Brown. "Don't tell me we've got to sit and watch that awful programme. Isn't there anything else better on the telly?" The rest of the family exchanged some uneasy glances. "Paddington did ask if we could have it on," said Mrs. Brown. "It's his favourite programme and he seemed particularly anxious that we shouldn't miss it tonight." "In that case," said Mr. Brown, "why isn't he here?" "I expect he's popped out somewhere," said Mrs. Brown soothingly. "He'll probably be back in a minute." Mr. Brown sank back into the seat with a grunt and stared distastefully at the television screen as a fanfare of trumpets heralded the start of "Lucky for Some," and the Master of Ceremonies, Ronnie Playfair, came bounding onto the stage, rubbing his hands with glee. "I wouldn't mind," said Mr. Brown, "if he'd asked sensible questions, but to give all that money away for all the sorts of things he asks is ridiculous." The dining room curtains were drawn, and the Brown family, with the exception of Paddington, who had been unaccountably missing since shortly after tea, were settled in a small half circle facing the television set in preparation for this evening's viewing. Over the past few weeks, a change had come over the routine at number 32, Windsor Gardens. Normally, the Browns were the sort of family who entertained themselves quite happily, but since the arrival of the television set, practically every evening had been spent in semi-darkness as they sat with their eyes glued to the screen. All the same, although Mr. Brown was the first to admit it out loud, the 9 days' wonder of having pictures in their own home was beginning to wear a bit thin now, and there were several signs of restlessness as yet another fanfare of trumpets burst from the loudspeaker. "I do hope nothing's happened to Paddington," whispered Mrs. Brown. "It's not like him to miss any of the programmes, especially a quiz. He's very keen on quizzes." "That bear's been acting very strangely all week," said Mrs. Bird. "Ever since he got that letter. I've a nasty feeling it may have something to do with the letter." "Well, it can't be anything bad," said Mrs. Brown. "He seems to have spent all of his time with his whiskers buried in those encyclopedias of Mr. Gruber's. He even missed his second helping at lunch today." "That's just it," said Mrs. Bird. "It's much too good to be true." While Ronnie Playfair's face grew larger and larger on the screen as he explained the programme to the studio audience and the viewers at home, the Browns began to discuss Paddington's strange behaviour over the last week. As Mrs. Bird had said, it all began when he received an important-looking letter by the first post one morning. At the time, nobody had paid it a great deal of attention, for he often got sent away for catalogues or any free samples which he saw advertised in the newspapers. But a little later that same morning he had arrived home pushing Mr. Gruber's encyclopedias in his basket on wheels, and the next day, after borrowing Mr. Brown's library tickets, another pile of books had been added to the already large one at his bedside. "He's been asking the oddest questions too," said Mrs. Brown. "I don't know where he gets it from." "Well, whatever it is," said Mr. Brown, as he looked up from his evening paper, "I hope he gets back soon." Mr. Brown liked plays, and he'd just discovered there was a particularly good one about to start on the other channel. "Crikey!" exclaimed Jonathan suddenly, as he jumped up from his seat and pointed to the television screen. "No wonder Paddington isn't here. Look!" "Gracious me!" exclaimed Mrs. Bird, as she followed his gaze. "It can't be." Mr. Brown adjusted his glasses. "It jolly well is," he said. "It's Paddington and Mr. Gruber." While the Browns had been talking, Ronnie Playfair had finished describing the workings of the programme. Waving his hand cheerily at the studio audience, he stepped back down off the stage into the beam of a large spotlight and announced that the first contestant of the evening was a Mr. Brown of London. As he made his way up the aisle, the camera followed him and eventually came to rest on two familiar faces at the end of the row of seats. Mr. Gruber's look of embarrassment was tinged with a faint air of guilt as he caught sight of his own face on a nearby screen. Although Paddington hadn't assured him that the Browns liked surprises, he wasn't at all sure they would be keen on this particular one. But Mr. Gruber was soon lost from view as a small brown figure sitting next to him raised a battered hat to the camera and hurried up the aisle after the Master of Ceremonies. If the Browns were overcome at the sight of Paddington climbing onto the stage, Ronnie Fairplay was equally at a loss for words, which was most unusual. Are you sure you're the right Mr. Brown?" he asked nervously, as Paddington dumped his suitcase on the stage and raised his hat to the audience. "Oh yes, Mr. Fairplay," said Paddington, waving a piece of paper importantly in the air. "I've got your letter asking me to come." I didn't know there were any bears in Notting Hill Gate," said Ronnie Fairplay. "I come from Peru," said Paddington, "but I live in London." "Oh, well," said Ronnie Fairplay, recovering himself slightly. "We won't ask you to prove that, but I suppose we must expect the bare facts tonight." "Prove that," he said, laughing at his own joke in a rather high voice. "Bare facts." His voice died away as he caught Paddington's eye. Paddington didn't think much of Ronnie Fairplay's jokes, and he was giving him a particularly hard stare. Perhaps you'd like to step forward and send a message home," said the Master of Ceremonies hurriedly. "We always ask our contestants to send a message home. It makes them feel at ease." Paddington bent down, took a piece of paper out of his suitcase. "Thank you very much, Mr. Fairplay," he exclaimed, as he began advancing onto the camera. The Browns watched in fascination as Paddington loomed large on their screen. "Hello, all at number 32 Windsor Gardens," said Paddington. "I hope I shan't be late home, Mrs. Bird. Mr. Gruber promised to bring me straight home." Whatever else Paddington had been about to say was lost as there came a loud crash and the picture disappeared from the screen. "Oh no!" cried Judy. "Don't say it's broken down. Not tonight. Not of all nights." "It's all right," said Jonathan. "Look, they've got another camera on." As he spoke, another picture flashed onto the screen. It wasn't quite such a nice one of the close-up of Paddington. Until just before the end, it had all gone a bit fuzzy and soft, and one had shown almost every whisker, whereas the new picture was looking towards the audience, and there appeared to be some confusion. One of the cameramen was sitting on the floor, surrounded by wires and cables, rubbing his head. And Ronnie Playfair seemed to be having some kind of argument with a man wearing headphones. "He wasn't on his marks," cried the cameraman. "He kept following me. You can't take proper close-ups if people don't sit on their marks." Paddington peered at the floor. "My marks?" he said. "But I had a bath before I came out." "He doesn't mean dirt marks," said Ronnie Playfair, pointing at the yellow chalk line. "He means that sort of mark. You're supposed to stand there, where I put you, otherwise the camera can't take their shots." "You did ask me to step forward," said Paddington Bear, looking a bit upset. "I said step forward," said Ronnie Playfair crossly, "not go for a walk." Ronnie Playfair had been Master of Ceremonies for several years, with never a word out of place, let alone an upset like the one that was just about occurring, and there was a strained look on his face as he picked his way back across the cables, closely followed by Paddington Bear, who was peering anxiously at the floor in case he lost sight of his chalk mark again. "Now," he said, as they reached the centre of the stage and stood facing the cameras, "what would you like to be questioned on?" He waved his hand in the direction of 4 barrels which stood in a row by a nearby table. "You can have history, geography, mathematics, or general knowledge." Paddington thought for a moment. "I think I'd like to try my paw at mathematics, please," he announced, amid applause from the audience. "Crikey," said Jonathan. "Fancy choosing that." "Knowing the way Paddington does the shopping," said Mrs. Bird, "I think it's a very wise choice." Paddington had a reputation among the street traders in Portobello Market for striking a hard bargain, and it was generally acknowledged that you had to get up very early in the morning, indeed, to cheat the better of Paddington. "I must say he always keeps his accounts very neatly," said Mrs. Brown. "I'm sure it's the right choice." "Mathematics," repeated Ronnie Playfair. "OK then, well, we'd better go at the first question." He put his hand into one of the barrels and withdrew a piece of paper. "A nice easy one to start with," he announced approvingly. "A very good question for a bear. If you get it right, there's a prize of £5. After a short drum roll, Ronnie Playfair raised his hands for silence. "For a prize of £5, he announced. "How many buns make 5? "I must warn you," he said, winking at the audience. "Think carefully. It may be a trick question. How many buns make 5? Paddington thought for a moment. 2.5, he replied. Ronnie Playfair's jaw dropped slightly. 2.5, he repeated. "Are you sure you won't change your mind?" 2.5, said Paddington firmly. "Oh, poor old Paddington," said Jonathan. "Fancy getting the first one wrong." "I am surprised," said Mrs. Bird. "It's not like him at all, unless he's got something up his paw." "Oh dear," said the Master of Ceremonies, as he picked up a hammer and struck a large gong by the side. "I'm afraid you're out of the contest. The answer is 5. "I don't think it is, Mr. Playwright," said Paddington. Playfair," said Mr. Playfair. "It's 2.5. I always share my buns with Mr. Gruber when we have our 11s, and I break them in half." Ronnie Playfair's jaw dropped even further, and the smile froze on his face. "You share your buns with Mr. Gruber," he repeated. "Give him the money!" cried somebody in the audience as the applause died down. "You said it might be a trick question," cried somebody else amid all the laughter. "Now you've got a trick answer." Ronnie Playfair fingered his collar nervously, and a strange look came over his face as he received a signal from the man wearing headphones to give Paddington the money. "Are you going to stop now there, Bear?" he asked hopefully as he handed Paddington 5 crisp £1 notes. "Or do you want to go to the next stage of £50? "I'd like to go on, please, Mr. Playfair," said Paddington. eagerly, as he hurriedly locked the money away in his suitcase. "I shouldn't do that," Ronnie Playfair said, as he dipped his hand into the barrel and withdrew another piece of paper. "If you get this question wrong, I shall want those £5 back." "Oh dear," said Mrs. Brown at home. "I feel all turned up inside. I hope Paddington doesn't do anything silly and lose his £5. He'll be so upset." "Right," said Ronnie Playfair, holding up his hand once again for silence. "For £50, here is question number 2. And it's a two-parter. Listen very carefully. If," he said, "you had a piece of wood 8 feet long and you cut it in half, and you cut the 2 pieces you then have in half, and if you then cut all the pieces in half again, how many pieces would you have?" "8," said Paddington promptly. "Very good, Bear," said Ronnie Playfair approvingly. "Now," he continued, pointing to a large clock by his side, "here is the second part of the question. How long will each piece be? You now have 10 seconds, starting from now." "8 feet," said Paddington, almost before the Master of Ceremonies had begun to start the clock. "8 feet?" reported Ronnie Playfair. "You're sure you don't want to change your mind?" "No, thank you, Mr. Playfair," said Paddington firmly. "In that case," said Ronnie Playfair, as he triumphantly banged the gong, "I have to ask you for your £5 back. The answer is 1 foot. If I had a piece of wood 8 feet long and I cut it into half, I'd have 2 pieces 4 feet long. If I cut those into half, I would have 4 pieces 2 feet long. And if I cut each of those in half, I would have 8 pieces 1 foot long." Having finished this speech, Ronnie Playfair turned and beamed a self-satisfied smile to the audience. "You can't argue with that, Bear," he said. "Oh no, Mr. Playfair," said Paddington politely. "I'm sure you're right for your piece of wood, but I cut mine the other way." Once again the smile froze on Ronnie Playfair's face. "You did what?" he exclaimed. "I cut mine down the middle," said Paddington, "so I had 8 pieces 8 feet long." "But if you're asked to cut a plank of wood in half," stuttered Ronnie Playfair, "you cut it across the middle, not down the middle. It's obvious." "Not if you're a bear," said Paddington, remembering his efforts at carpentry in the past. "If you're a bear, it's much safer to cut it down the middle." Ronnie Playfair took a deep breath and forced a sickly smile on his face as he handed Paddington a large bundle of notes. "I think you'll find they're all there, Bear," he said stiffly, as Paddington sat down on the stage and began counting them. "We're not in the habit of dindling people here." Ronnie Playfair looked anxiously at his watch. The programme seemed to be taking a lot longer than usual. Normally he would have got through it at least 5 contestants by now. Paddington counted out the £50 and popped them into his suitcase. "There's only 5 minutes left," he said. "Do you want to go for the final prize of £500? £500? Exclaimed Judy in a tone of awe back at home. "If I were Paddington," said Mrs. Brown, "I'd stop now and make sure of what I'd got." The Browns grouped themselves together even closer round the television screen as one of the cameras showed a close-up picture of Paddington considering the matter. "I think I'd like to carry on, Mr. Playfair," he announced at last amid a burst of applause. Although Paddington was not the sort of bear who normally believed in taking too many chances as far as money was concerned, he was much too excited by all that had taken place that evening to think clearly about the matter. "Well," said Ronnie Playfair in his most solemn voice, "here, for a prize of £500, is the last question of the evening. And this time it's a much harder one. It would be, said Mrs. Brown, holding her breath. If, continued Ronnie Playfair, it takes 2 men 20 minutes to fill a 50-gallon bath full of water using one tap, how long will it take 1 man to fill the same bath using both taps? This time you've got 20 seconds starting from now. Ronnie Playfair pressed a button on the clock by his side and then stood back to await Paddington's answer. No time at all, Mr. Playfair, said Paddington promptly. Wrong, exclaimed Ronnie Playfair as a groan came up from the audience. I'm afraid this time you really have got it wrong. It will take exactly half of the time. I'm very sorry, Bear, he continued, looking most relieved as he gave the gong a bang with his hammer. Better luck next time. I think you must be wrong, Mr. Playfair, said Paddington politely. Nonsense, said the Master of Ceremonies, giving Paddington a nasty look. The answer's on the card. In any case, it's bound to take some time, isn't it? You can't fill a bath in no time at all. But you said it was the same bath, explained Paddington. The first 2 men had already filled the bath once, and then you didn't say anything about pulling the plug out. Ronnie Playfair's face seemed to go a strange purple colour in the studio. And even on the Browns' receiver it went several shades darker as he stared at Paddington. I didn't say anything about them pulling the plug out, he repeated. But of course they pulled the plug out. You didn't say so, cried a voice in the audience as several boos broke out. That Bear's quite right. Give him the money, cried somebody else as several more voices added to the general uproar. Ronnie Playfair seemed to shudder slightly as he withdrew a silk handkerchief from his jacket pocket and patted his brow. Congratulations, Bear, he said grudgingly after a pause. You've won the jackpot. What? Exclaimed Paddington hotly as he gave Ronnie Playfair one of his hardest stares ever. I've won a jackpot? I thought you said it was going to be £500. It is £500, Ronnie Playfair said hastily. It's the top prize. It's what we call the jackpot. As the applause rang through the theatre, Paddington sat down on his suitcase, hardly able to believe his ears. Although he knew there must be £500 in the world, he had never in his wildest dreams thought he might one day see it in one big pile, let alone be told it was his. Ronnie Playfair held up his hand for silence. One final question before we end the programme, he exclaimed, and there's no prize for this one. What are you going to do with all that money? Paddington considered the matter for a long time, as the audience went very quiet. When you usually counted your money in terms of how many buns it would buy, it was a very difficult thing to even begin to think about a sum like £500, let alone decide what to do with it. And when he tried to think of £500 worth of buns, he grew a bit dizzy. I think, he said at last, as the camera came closer and closer, I would like to keep a little bit as a souvenir and buy some Christmas presents. Then I would like to give the rest of the money to the Home for Retired Bears in Lima. The Home for Retired Bears in Lima, repeated Ronnie Playfair, looking most surprised. That's right, said Paddington. That's where my Auntie Lucy lives. She's very happy there, but I don't think she's got very much money. They only have marmalade on Sundays, so I expect they would find it very useful indeed. Everybody applauded Paddington's announcement, and the applause grew louder and louder. Still, a few moments later, when Ronnie Playfair announced on behalf of the television company that they would see to it that the Home for Retired Bears in Lima was well supplied with marmalade for at least a year to come. After all, he said, it isn't every week a bear wins the jackpot in one of our prize programmes. "Well, I'm blowed," said Mr. Brown, mopping his brow as the programme came to an end, and the captions began rolling past on the screen over a picture of Paddington as he stood in the middle of the stage, receiving everybody's congratulations. "I never thought we'd bought a television set that it would actually come to this." "Fancy Paddington giving his money away," said Jonathan. "He's actually usually very careful with his money." "Careful isn't the same as being mean," said Mrs. Bird wisely. "And I must say I'm very glad. I never did like the thought of all those bears only having marmalade on Sundays. After all," she added amid general agreement, "if it hadn't been for Auntie Lucy, we shouldn't have met Paddington. And if that doesn't deserve a bit of extra marmalade, I don't know what does."